Through an amalgamation of all that defines power politics, such as their imperial conquests, which led to the rise of their borders, as well as the manipulative use of political philosophy which attempts to legitimize them in the understandings and rationale of their tamed constituents, nation-states have come to litter our world map and become the status quo of the past few hundred years. This status quo is one which is wholly encompassing for their respective constituents, you, I, and virtually everyone else on Earth. As captives of the modern nation-state, we find it incredibly hard to imagine a different world, in the same vein that a subject of a medieval-era monarch would have found it equally as hard to imagine an alternative to their feudal system. Political organization is a state of existence for societies which changes slowly, over the course of centuries. For instance, the 21st century is the 5th century of our current era, the era of nation-states, subsequent the era of kingdoms and empires. This contemporary era was initiated by two events. Firstly, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which established the guides on extraterritorial conduct, as each state was assigned to the attribute of sovereign power over its territory, and secondly, the French Revolution of 1789, culminating in the first society which prioritized national self-determination over the desires of monarchs. However, the passage of time across many centuries has proven to be a generally progressive force. If history is any indicator whatsoever, humanity will not settle with the current shortcomings, atrocities, and misgivings of the nation-state. Rather, humanity will continue the trend of transforming political organization forwards. The form of organized power which we, as the contemporary inhabitants of our own respective 21st centuries, are most acquainted with, is government, specifically in the form of a nation-state. And the governments that make up the international stage of our time are wholly enabled by historical conquests, which were only enabled by extremely unfair power imbalances which facilitated their expansions. For instance, between the London-based royals of England, there was no technological parity with the rural clans in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, who faced off against England's gunpowder, cannons, and resources with swords, bows, and simply less resources. To evidence this with one prime example taken from British history, we can see that the Battle of Culloden in 1746 doomed the Jacobite rising to failure as an example of technological disparity leading to conquest and oppression. While total government losses that day numbered in the hundreds, Jacobites killed on the field totaled around 3,000, illustrating the enormous technological discrepancy between the Jacobites and the government forces of England. This encompassed not just the material technological differences, as government troops enjoyed advantages in artillery, such as greater muskets, bayonets, cannons, and mortars, but also tactical technology, such as cavalry charges and line infantry formations. While the conflict surrounding the Jacobite Rising of 1745 was not an expansion of English dominion over Scotland, as that had already occurred, it nonetheless evidences the point that one group with more resources and technology can dominate that of the other. Other examples of this are limitless across history, particularly the New World conquests of North and South America, as well as Oceania, or the scramble for Africa. In other words, due to the monopoly on technology, certain groups historically were able to solidify more power to enable them in their conquests, therefore obtaining their ability to rule, i.e. their practical authority, through simply being more advanced than their enemies. Fast-track the momentum in the case of the British Isles from their domestic affairs and conquests to the era of colonialism, and you see the exact same thing on a much greater scale. However, some peoples took it upon themselves to centralize their power, as the era of vast empires in the 18th and 19th centuries meant that those without such an empire would inevitably succumb to those with the power of an empire provided. In other words, in a world where empires have practical monopolies on manpower, resources, technology, and innovation, those without empires are doomed to conquest. For instance, before the Napoleonic Wars of 1803 to 1815, Italy was a highly decentralized peninsula, which could have been described as a patchwork of independent governments, as in 1796 the Italian peninsula was divided into 10 states. Nevertheless, the increasing scale of the conflicts between rising nations and powers in the 19th century caused Italy to be confronted with two options: succumb to foreign powers or centralize their own power. As such, the unification of Italy began. Later, the Italian king Vittorio Emanuele I stated in 1861, nearly entirely united, Italy herself too will become a guarantee of order and peace, as a remark of the result of unification. Ultimately, the creation of modern governments has technological disparities between varying groups to thank for their respective conceptions. The United States of America has the technology of Europe to thank for their ability to manifest their destiny westwards unto the less advanced natives. Russia has the resources with which the Kievan Rus emerged from in the west, between the White Sea in the north and the Black Sea in the south, to thank for their ability to expand into and exert their sovereignty unto the Siberian tundras and wilderness. If it were not for the localization of resources leading to the domino effect of certain groups having advantages over others, where those resources were inversely lacking, then we would not see such a consolidation of power with which we are familiar of. However, the 21st century completely changes this power dynamic, rendering the necessity in nation-states for security as irrevocably obsolete. Technology has developed past the point by which a central territorial authority has an irreconcilable advantage over all relevant regions. Ultimately, the rise of large political organizations as we know them originates in the historical ability of specific groups to obtain an upper hand against other groups. Yet such a power dynamic no longer exists due to a multitude of changes, namely those resulting from globalization. Technology which facilitated the rise of globalized trade, including yet not limited to railroads, shipping, flight, and telecommunications, will lead to the decline of centralized state actors. In other words, state actors have technological disparities to thank for their rise and ability to consolidate power, yet we enter an era where localized monopolies on resources are rendered inadequate to maintaining and creating power due to the democratization of the resources by which political actors and groups maintain their power. Globalization and technology progression made this so. Additionally, technological innovations have pushed the envelope past the point whereby security in nation-states is necessary, therefore rendering the state as nothing more than an authoritarian relic of a bygone era. For instance, Singapore, a relatively minuscule nation-state with no localized resources, is equipped with the 29th best-ranked armed forces in the world as of 2025, which is completely antithetical to the previous relevant logic of needing manpower and resources to maintain or acquire strength. The legitimization of the state occurs because of two premises being achieved. Firstly, a modern nation-state has all the power in a defined territory, as we have discussed. Max Weber stated over a century ago that the state is a human community that claims the monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory, known simply as the monopoly on violence by many. The second premise is that the state utilizes rhetoric, philosophy, concepts, and so forth, in some form, to achieve acquiescence, toleration, or even wholehearted endorsement to govern. To put it simply, the two parts of governing involve neutralizing rival claims to power and convincing the governed to at least tolerate your rule. Thomas Hobbes famously asserted in his renowned book Leviathan in 1651 that life outside society would be solitary, poor, nasty, Brutus, and short, with his notion of society referring to a population beneath a sovereign authority to whom all individuals in that society cede some rights for the sake of protection. Therefore, he was referring to a state. This, throughout the past millennium, the desire to avoid the violence and chaos attributed to statelessness, has in part solidified the legitimacy of nation-states, even in the minds of their very own constituents, as a desirable situation in opposition to anarchy. For a contemporary example of the rhetorical triumph of the state over freedom, the modern listener need recall no further than that of the pandemonium surrounding COVID-19, which led to widespread lockdowns, restrictions on all myriad of rights to travel, rights to work, to bodily autonomy, and etc., all consequential from the general demand for a restriction on our freedoms for our safety. This has been of concern by political theorists already for centuries, particularly from the Enlightenment era, with Benjamin Franklin famously espousing, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." The legitimization of a state in its expanding infancy best occurs if it is perceived to be at the benefit of its own people, regardless of whether it is a kingdom or a nation-state. One such way that the state can be to the benefit of its people is through conflict and dispute resolution. The historical progression of England's state shows this. Offering themselves as a mechanism for legal resolutions first manifested as the Curia Regis, or King's Court, the people accepted their rule. While kings, queens, emperors, and empresses do not constitute more than 8% of the world's population today, the historically infamous divine right to rule, historically used by many of them, serves as a prime example of how political entities such as the state, after having gained their monopoly on violence, turn to certain concepts to convince the people of their right to rule. The nation-state in the aftermath of the French Revolution created shifts in fundamental understandings about the nature and justifications of political institutions towards that of national self-determination, according to Chimene Keitner of Oxford University. The Westphalian system had previously established a principle of the recognition of state sovereignty and right to decide its own fate, which continues to rest at the foundations of international law today. This was quite simply a progression in the continued trend and increasing promotion of self-determination, referring to the concern of the fundamental right of people to shape their own lives, from the fate of millions of people being determined by aristocrats and noble bloodlines, to the post-Westphalian world order having nation-states, which are in theory governments for the interests of the governed, generally along national boundaries. In other words, while the Kingdom of France was for the interests of noble bloodlines, the French republics as successive nation-states have been at least structurally intended to be for the interests of the French people, broadly speaking. This underlying feature of the state, as being for the people, its nation, is at the heart of every single civil engagement, whether it be the avoidance of danger, as suggested by Hobbes, or an express mandate by the divine, as still seen today in Iran's Ayatollah. The point is that the government will use some concept or rhetoric to justify its existence once it has the monopoly on power. The national self-determinative form, as seen in the West, is shown by the following rhetoric. The police are meant to protect and serve the community. The politicians are elected representatives. Citizens cast ballots in the democratic process. However, the great comedy of our time is that there is no structural feature which could ever possibly ensure that this is legitimately the case. In essence, if the government can convince you that its existence, resulting in the diminishment of your freedoms, is to the benefit of your safety and social cohesion, or to fulfill an obligation to a higher cause, then the tighter their grip on society may become, the more legitimate that their rule will be. As such, it has always been said by the state that without their rule, society would be reneging on its obligations, casting away the supposed utility of the state, or life would be nasty, Brutus, and short. Fundamentally, state legitimacy rests on citizens' perceptions and expectations of the state, and each state, as previously discussed, asserts a certain notion underpinning their right to rule. Every one of them can be successfully nullified with the fact that they are not true. There is no convincing a deluded mind that God is governing by proxy through a supreme leader. However, when operating upon the assumption that human communities will continue focusing on self-determination in the future, as indicated by past progression, we can see that this is also a shortcoming of the state. Hobbes was wrong. The brutish reality of existence seems to occur with or without the presence of the state. There are several characteristics of the state which its supporters argue come only from the state. Firstly, one which is often argued is that the state represents the people, pursues their desires, and achieves their goals, as per the notion of nation-states adhering to their people's yearning for self-determination. Yet this is nonetheless patently false. According to, as of writing this section, the approval rating of 24 countries ranging from India to Argentina to the United States and Australia, among many others, as recorded by Jason McMahon and Sunette Frisbee from the Morning Consult, the average approval rating for the democratically elected leaders of the world only sits at 39.52%. This means that most constituents in democratic nation-states disapprove of their elected leaders. Furthermore, amongst a wide array of nation-states ranging from the Netherlands to Canada to Mexico and Saudi Arabia, the global average rating for trust in government sat only at 51% in 2023. As such, it seems that if the government is meant to be fulfilling the desires of its constituents, it certainly falls short of this goal. But this is because it is not the goal of those with power. Regardless of rhetorical assertions that this be the case, the fundamental reality of power, according to psychologist David Keitner at the end of his study, Does Power Corrupt?, was that inequity in power is disruptive of harmonious social relations. Furthermore, he asserted that power increases the likelihood that the individuals will attempt to influence and manipulate others. And no form of power is as unrivaled, unchallenged, and empowered as that of the monopoly of the state. This is further illustrated by the unending list of inequities and moral crimes against mankind conducted by the state, such as the reality of democide, referring to the intentional killing of an unarmed or disarmed person by government agents, coined by Holocaust historian R.J. Rummel. Rummel estimated that 50 million people had died to colonialism in the 20th century, or within the same time frame, 2 million foreigners were killed in cold blood by democracies, or the 148 million by communist and socialist regimes, and finally 21 million by right-wing authoritarians such as Nazi Germany in the same century. As such, Rummel estimated that between 1900 and 1994, there were between 200 and 221 million deaths by government. But the naysayers to this ultimate worry of government proclaim that it would never be my government, of course. Nevertheless, power is power, and like any other form of government, even your government does it too, such as the reality of having unbridled authority over a population. We will see a select few nation-states, which are perceived as good by many on the world stage, but nonetheless have histories of abuse of power. While numbers on direct deaths are not well studied, the abuse of power in Australia is still evident in government involvement in the frontier wars and committing massacres, or the stolen generations policy, ongoing deaths in custody, medical experiments on Aboriginals, and even nuclear experiments. In Sweden, there was a mass sterilization program by the Swedish State Institute for Racial Biology, with over 63,000 victims. There was a forced assimilation of the Sami people, institutional oppression of the Roma people as well. In Ireland, there was the state-funded reality of industrial schools, where the Ryan Report exposed decades of government-supported systemic abuse against children, or the mother and baby home scandal, where unwed pregnant women were institutionalized and forced into relinquishing their babies for adoption. In hospitals, where the high infant mortality rates led to mass graves. And one should not forget Iceland, which, despite being heralded as a moral nation-state, had forced sterilization policies against the feeble-minded until the 1970s, or Finland's forced sterilization legal program, and further Sami assimilation and land dispossession. One should certainly not seek to place an impossible standard on humans, such as having no track record of immoral conduct, as no one is perfect at the end of the day. There is no doubt that no matter what state you're in, your state is not impervious to abusing its power, and that goes for all forms of power. It will eventually be abused. But the problem with government is, if it is not abundantly clear already, is that it is a monopolized power. There is no ability to appeal to another authority for help when the police are the ones oppressing you. For the United States, for instance, a state that undoubtedly has a blemished record, who should the victims of civil forfeiture appeal to, when the police are the ones who steal more money and monetary value each year than the criminals of the country? Who should victims of any such state appeal to when the supposed arbiters of justice and order are the ones causing injustice and disorder? When Thomas Hobbes famously asserted that life without the state would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, he obviously did not consider that the state can be the harbinger of such conditions. These conditions were, in the time of Hobbes, reasoned to be a natural consequence of human nature being unbridled and unregulated. However, Hobbes failed to deduce from either reason, historical or contemporary analysis that the state is just an extension of human nature. In no way are the manifestations of humanity in the form of state apparatus separate from human nature. Instead, it becomes an even more potent form of all that proponents of the state argues it will instead suppress. It is assumed by Hobbesian thinkers that the state is somehow wholly separate from the greed, corruption, prejudice, ambitions for power that human beings otherwise have. Yet this fundamentally neglects to acknowledge that the state is only human. The leaders, foot soldiers, bureaucrats, and all that makes up the very apparatus of a state are merely human, with those very same dreaded desires which the philosophy driving grander political organization stresses against. Thus the feared features of human nature are only amplified through the state, as history in lieu of Hobbes has proven time and time again. Generally, the stories of history's greatest and grandest states, the strongest institutions, have shown that the stronger the state, the stronger the human features within the state become. For instance, the grand totality of both Hitler's Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union were deeply characterized in policy by their human personalities, with historian Robert C. Tucker stating in The Dictator and Totalitarianism that the two dictators demonstrated psychiatric conditions which would be designated as paranoid. Furthermore, Stalin and Hitler's needs alike as paranoidal people were powerful motivating factors in dictatorial decision-making and were not confined to their personal lives. Rather than restrain human nature, Nazism and Stalinism both systematically industrialized human nature, from the NKVD and Gestapo to the purging of military officials. On the other hand, while defenders of the state may point out that these examples are that of dictators, whereby one human being is essentially responsible for all the wrongdoings of the state, as opposed to a greater bureaucratic organism, there are plenty of examples of human shortcomings again being enhanced by the state. Australia's atrocities against the native Aboriginal, including the stolen generation, in addition to the current Australian immigration detention scheme, Canada's residential school system, South Africa's apartheid bureaucracy, the United States' own plethora of examples, including yet not limited to the Tuskegee syphilis trials, to Japanese-American Second World War internment camps on the basis of race, and many others, to the Chinese surveillance state and Israel's own apartheid system comparable to that of South Africa. Amongst all these examples are deeply human emotions, such as paranoia, disgust, hate, all with no clear villain at the helm, but rather the state as a collective, acting nonetheless deeply human and flawed. Nevertheless, the greatest example of them all goes again to Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, with the elephant in the room being that of the Holocaust. In no way was the Holocaust a strategic or rational endeavor in any such capacity. Instead, it was an undertaking entirely motivated by disgust, one of the most human of all emotions. While initiated from the ideology of one madman, it involved the ordinary functions of the state, from train schedulers to census takers, in addition to the Schutzstaffel and even Wehrmacht manpower, being dedicated to the systemic final solution to the Jewish problem, as it was referred to in common parlance amongst Nazi members. Dictators do not act in isolation, but with the mandates of their constituents, although not explicitly as clear and as strong as that of democracy. As a result, perhaps the greatest atrocity of humanity, motivated not through a cold, unfeeling and mechanistic bureaucracy, as Hobbes would put it, but instead a deeply irrational and passionate and emotional bureaucracy in the most human of all ways, culminated in millions of deaths. All in all, when human nature is corrupted by power, Hobbesian thinkers in the contemporary age are indisputably ignorant of the magnification that the state enables to human nature, as opposed to the restraint they argue it offers to serve. The argument that if there was no law, nothing would stop X from committing violence against Y, thus we need the state to protect us from brutality, ceases to apply when you realize that the state is the greatest perpetrator of violence and brutality that there ever was or ever will be. Although a hard pill for the layman to swallow, security in the nation-state need not be the case. While captive in the system of a nation-state from cradle to grave, we rarely conceive of a world where its monopolized power does not exist. Thus we do not ponder the necessary reform that would lead to its replacement, nor the consequences of such a replacement. The governments of the world have effectively created a reality wherein each of their constituents are only capable of imagining reform within the system, or at most reform that introduces a new regime, rather than a more complete change. Therefore, such attempts at reform only amount to a redundancy. While political organization has precipitously collectivized as technology has evolved since the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century, it is this very same feature of the modern age which will inevitably work against the great collectives which plague our time. As such, reform is happening around us, slowly, but nevertheless surely. Total statelessness is not the solution, nor is it where most of the world is headed. For instance, the future of political organization in some parts of the world will gravitate towards more authoritarianism rather than less. However, as has been established, the fundamental bases for which the vast majority of states who manifest almost entirely on a constituent-endorsed nation-state basis are farcical and failing, largely due to globalization and technological innovation. To clarify, the coming century is more than likely to encompass an overall turn away from the nation-states system, both towards systems of greater and lesser government in different parts of the world. The increasing displeasure held by constituents across the civilized world will result in reform whether it is contemporarily tangible to the layman or not, but it will manifest both differently and to varying degrees across the world. With the first focus on the Anglosphere, this is where statelessness is most likely to manifest, almost entirely due to the respective states, such as the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, all being founded upon nations which no longer exist. The United Kingdom was founded for the purpose of serving the interests of Britons. However, current trends make this form of government unsustainable. According to a report from Buckingham University's Professor Matthew Goodwin in this year, white British people, defined as individuals without an immigrant parent, will become a minority in the United Kingdom by 2063. Within 38 years, the people that the government of Britain are for will no longer be the primary constituents for the government of Britain, and within 75 years, by the year 2100, the report predicts that the white British share of the population could have fallen to 33.7%. This problem is already apparent in certain areas of Britain, with the population centre of Great London in 2021 having only 36.8% of its population being white British, with large swathes of its population coming from continental Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. This is not a commentary on whether the ethnic composition of a society is important, as it would be ludicrous to suggest. Rather, it is entirely one on the implications of a democracy in which voting constituents become a demographic which no longer values the same concepts which a native-born population hold true to their self-determination through the mechanisms of a nation-state. You simply cannot expect the same nation-state, with all of its democratic functions, to continue existing when that nation it is founded upon no longer exists. The rest of the Anglosphere is following suit, with Australia having received a net migration addition of 536,000 people in the 2022 financial year, Canada having received 483,000 new permanent residents, and New Zealand reaching 135,700 in the same year, with all of their relatively low populations, respectively being 27 million, 40 million, and 5.2 million. These large numbers of net migration growth are unsustainable, especially over decades. The admirable yet flawed liberal democratic values which champion these migration movements will lead to the deaths of these respective nation-states within 2 or 3 generations at these projected levels. While it is impossible to predict the future, as doing so would be akin to betting against God due to the many unforeseen actors and factors unbeknownst to be at play, it is still nonetheless conservative to say that these governments will no longer exist. They are on borrowed time. Again, you simply cannot have nation-states predicated upon serving a specific national populace when that populace in question no longer exists as the majority constituency. So, what is the future of the Anglosphere? Well, while not a direct parallel, the history of the so far unmentioned Anglosphere state can serve as an indicator. The United States. The United States of America has, since the adoption of the U.S. Constitution in 1789, been a federal political organization, yet the identity of being an American is a more recently adopted concept. As Edmund Wright stated in his book The Fabric of Freedom, in summarizing the American Revolution, quote, "There were, in a sense, 13 revolutions rather than a single national movement, for there was no nation as yet." The patriotism which so characterizes America's national identity today took a long time to triumph over that of the state identity. While it was as early as 1774 that Patrick Henry, a revolutionary delegate, stated that distinctions between Virginians, Pennsylvanians, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. "I am not a Virginian but an American." State identity continued to dominate nonetheless until the Civil War, and even to a degree persist well into the 21st century. In the South, this was most prominent due to the emphasis on states' rights over federalism. For instance, Robert E. Lee refused to raise his hand against his birthplace, his native state Virginia, when commanded. Additionally, while obviously President Kennedy was not by any means an anti-federalist, he stated in his 1961 farewell address to the Massachusetts state legislature that, "Wherever I serve, this, Massachusetts, shall remain my home." A similar sentiment erring to state identity was even as recent as Kamala Harris stating that "we need to remind people that Texas Democrats are Texas tough. You are Texas tough." Tough like Texan President Lyndon B. Johnson, when speaking at the 2022 Texas Democratic Party reception. The point is that American history is full of, and even contemporary rhetoric is, to a degree, from the political sphere, a much more local identity, at times more important than that of national identity. The way this pertains to any relevant prediction as to the future is that, for practical reasons, this will see a resurgence and an emergence in the rest of the Anglosphere. While contemporary Australia, for instance, knows not of a state-based pride or identity, as you will never hear a Queenslander or a Victorian introduce themselves as any other such identity than Australian unless otherwise asked, the Anglosphere increasingly has the same problem: non-representative democracy at the federal level. In no way are the interests of multicultural London the same as the English countryside, as evidenced by the types of bills that multicultural representatives to Parliament table, juxtaposed by that of their rural peers, with the former tabling the Public Body Ethnicity Data Bill or the Woman, Peace and Security Bill, and the latter tabling the Access to Telecommunications Networks Bill or the Agricultural Land Planning Bill in recent years. The argument here is not to invalidate or criticize the content of any such bills, but rather point out that when a society becomes too centralized in decision-making, it accumulates a vast array of groups with too many interests to cohesively function within a democratic framework. Democracy simply does not work if you are incorporating the concerns and desires of so many different people who vote in their interests, often at the cost of others' interests. The greatest example of this requires leaving the Anglosphere to understand the faults of the European Parliament. The problem within the European Parliament is integral to its very structure. It is the fact that members of the European Parliament are appointed to the Parliament by their country, while voting on laws that affect people in other countries. Thus, the result is that there are French bureaucrats who affect the lives of German citizens, and German citizens only hold their own representatives accountable, and vice versa for each nation. This built-in feature of the European Parliament, the inability to obtain democratic accountability in a vast overseeing bureaucracy, was a foundational grievance motivating the Brexit campaign, with it being common rhetoric to state that we are ruled by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels, the home of the European Parliament. This stance was rhetoricized by Michael Gove of the House of Lords when he said, "Laws which govern citizens in this country are decided by politicians from other nations who we never elected and cannot throw out. And further, he said the ability to choose who governs us and the freedom to change laws we do not like were secured for us in the past by radicals and liberals who took power from unaccountable elites and placed it in the hands of the people. Examples of the self-determination of the European peoples within the European Union being trampled upon by its very own bureaucracy include that of the European Central Bank forcing austerity measures on an unwilling Greek public, or proceedings against Poland and Hungary's respective governments for judicial independence, or again Poland and Hungary, in addition to Slovakia, being overruled by the EU Council in order to be forced into accepting refugee relocation quotas. Going back to the United States to view the displeasure seen within their democratic system, in 2025 one should look no further than the daily news as to see why democracy is suffering. The 2024 re-election of Donald Trump saw over 75 million people, or 48.3% of the voting public as per the popular vote, thoroughly disappointed. The nearly 50-50 split of the American public having existed at least since the 2000 presidential election, wherein George W. Bush boasted only 47.9% to Al Gore's 48.4%. With Bush winning due to the intrinsically flawed electoral college system, it has quickly become entrenched in American politics to see a 50-50 split. This in turn has promoted the discourse of a national divorce, called for by Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. "We need to separate red states and blue states," she said, citing a YouGov poll that found 23% of Americans support their state seceding from the Union. The overall encompassing problem that large federal democratic political organizations, i.e. democratic nation-states, find themselves confronting in the modern era is that they are too bureaucratically centralized, while at the human level they are far too diverse to sustain such centrality. The same can be said for the 2025 German federal election, with constituents highly distinctly opposed across Cold War-era drawn phantom borders, or the 2024 French legislative election seeing similar East-Western divisions. The 2024 United Kingdom general election is distinctly notable, but nonetheless to the same point. There are different groups of people unhappy to be governed by the same leaders that other constituents equally vote for. It is important again to clarify that this is not a verification, an endorsement, nor a critique or a denunciation of any policies of the political figures, movements, or actions taken by the listed entities. Rather, this is entirely to illustrate the fragility of large national democracies. Therefore, ultimately, the future of the Western world is not one of the nation-states that we are familiar with, as has been prefaced. Not only are the foundational assumptions and tenets of the nation-state system in peril due to nation-states being founded upon the assumption that they are for the nation that they serve, yet the nations in question are disappearing and transforming day by day, but the philosophical and ethical justification for the nation-state's power are no longer applicable as well. Look at Saudi Arabia, which maintains its sovereignty and monopoly on power through the unseemly relationship it maintains with its people. The people are most undoubtedly oppressed and restricted. However, the Saudi regime maintains hegemony on power through providing welfare, or the fact that the majority of Saudis are employed by the state and taxes are minimal and they have state-funded healthcare and education, or they gain subsidies on basic utilities as well as land grants and low-cost housing loans. The Saudi government effectively compensates the people with a social contract that exchanges their freedoms for wealth and prosperity. This is juxtaposed by the failing governments of the democratic world, which disappoint more often than not. Living crises, rising crime, corruption, and inefficiency all plague the democracies of the world. Unlike Saudi Arabia, most of Europe and the Anglosphere are living paycheck to paycheck, with approximately 78% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck according to a 2023 poll which highlighted a 6% increase on the rate in 2022. As such, the future of the liberal, democratic Western world is that of fragmentation, decentralization, and the dissolution of the nation-state. America, again, a great example, is on path to a national divorce. The current socio-political status quo is only akin to the era prefacing the American Civil War. Throughout the 20th century, the United States was united by a common external enemy, whether it be Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. One thing kept the Americans neighborly, having external threats. And ultimately underpinning this were two things which have also since eroded: a Christian social ethic and a civic nationalism. By no means am I campaigning for a theocracy. However, civic nationalism and religious unity are two things which create a joint social fabric, and while a Gallup poll shows that since 2018, American patriotism has consistently been at an all-time low, and the dominant religion of Christianity has declined in America by 14 percentage points since the turn of the century. American division is at an almost all-time high, with 80% of Americans stating that American society is, quote, greatly divided on most important values. Similar social erosions can be seen throughout the Western world in total, all anchored in the loss of a shared social framework, creating hyper-tribalism in turn, in which there is no consensus validating the existence of a centralized authority. While again it is impossible to predict with certainty or accuracy, the next century will likely see the rise of localism, whereby different regions and cities will have autonomy beyond the point of there being any cohesive national identity nor government. San Francisco, New York, Miami, Austin, and myriad other American cities will all function as diverging enclaves, already in the contemporary era distinct enough in culture, distinct in law, politics, and so forth. The next step is for them to assert more autonomy, which will happen with the forecasted disunity and instability. The same can apply to Europe very easily. Just look at any cultural comparison between Berlin and rural Germany, or countryside France to Paris. The only difference in Europe is that languages will provide at least a rudimentary boundary for any such confederacy that may arise. Yet, the point is nonetheless clear. Social, political, and cultural disunity combined with failing and unjustified government will wipe out the political organizations we know today as Western nation-states. While the vast majority of nation-states will become afflicted by the problems I've thus far outlined, there are a number of nation-states which will continue to exist and function in perpetuity. For instance, Saudi Arabia is again a good example of a state which has no reason to erode, so long as their regime does not falter in any unforeseen ways. The point here is that certain authoritarian states, while certainly not admirable in any way, are effective at maintaining their authority. Authoritarian states such as China will quell separatist movements, as it has been ruthlessly doing so in Xinjiang against the Uyghur population, or Tibet against the Tibetans. Japan, on the other hand, while not an authoritarian regime, maintains its civic, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic nationalism, and as such, many of the afflictions diagnosed unto Western nation-states need not apply in Japan, as they are uniquely united. India, while highly ethnically and linguistically diverse, maintains a relatively hegemonic religious majority of Hinduism, as well as external threats such as Pakistan, which serves to internally unite the Indian people. Ultimately, while there are notable outliers, whether it be through such unique cultural positions or the iron fist of a regime, which will continue to exist in their current state form, the future is on a collision course for the economic, social, cultural, and political rearrangement of most of the developed world. In time, after the dust is settled, there is no reason that the form of political organization which arises out of the increased localism will not flourish and prosper in their own right, uninhibited by the restraints of their own current governments. Decentralized societies can maintain greater stability and minimize what would otherwise be systemic, all-afflicting problems.